She dragged a full pine log up a rocky slope, alone in October, no husband, no help, just rope over her shoulder and boots digging into frozen ground. Ryan Cole watched from his horse on the ridge. He should have kept riding, he didn't. When he rode down and looked at her face, really looked, he saw the scar, old burn, temple to jaw. She read his eyes before he could arrange them. Her chin came up, voice flat as iron. I'm not pretty, he didn't flinch. Didn't look away, that's fine. I need honest, not fancy. Winter kills pretty folk first out here. She blinked. Nobody had ever said that. Not once in 2 years of people looking at her face like it was a verdict. What she didn't know, what nobody in that town would tell him, was that the most powerful man in Crestfall had already decided this woman needed to disappear. Her land, her water, her name destroyed in court. And Ryan Cole had just walked straight into the middle of it. The woman dragged the pine log uphill alone. That was the first thing Ryan Cole saw from the ridge. Late October, whined off the bighorn sharp enough to find the gaps in his coat. He'd been riding the eastern fence line since before dawn, checking the posts his hands had set in September, routine work, quiet work, the kind of morning where a man could ride 3 hours and not say a word to anyone, which suited him fine. Then he crested the ridge and saw her, full-length pine log, green timber, not dried, heavier than it looked, which meant it looked impossible. Rope over her left shoulder, both hands gripping forward, boots digging into loose shale with every step. Her calico dress was mud-dark to the knees, her hair brown-red, thick, had mostly escaped whatever she'd tied it with and was whipping sideways in the wind. She did not stop. He sat on his horse and watched her for longer than he should have. Not because he couldn't move, because something about it wouldn't let him look away. 2 men would have cursed dragging that log up that slope. She was doing it alone and hadn't made a sound. He nudged the horse down. The half-built cabin came into view past the tree line. Walls maybe chest high. No roof yet, just 4 walls open to the sky, surrounded by cut timber stacked in careful rows, tools hanging on pegs someone had driven into the nearest completed wall. A canvas tent sagged against the south side. A fire pit with a coffee pot still on it. Everything arranged with the logic of someone who'd thought hard about where everything needed to go. She heard his approach and stopped, set the rope down, straightened up, breathing hard through her nose, and turned to face him. Didn't run, didn't call out, just stood there, chin level. Watching him come, he dismounted 20 feet out, ground-tied his horse, walked the rest. Closer now, he could see the scar, old, pale, running from her left temple down to the line of her jaw. Burn scar, he'd seen enough of them to know. The shape of it, the way it pulled slightly at the corner of her eye. Old enough that she'd stopped noticing people noticing it, or so she thought. She read his face before he could arrange it. Her shoulders went tight. Her chin came up another degree. I'm not pretty, flat, defensive. Not apology, something harder than that. Like a fact she'd learned to say before anyone else could. Ryan looked at her directly, not at the scar, at her eyes, gray-blue, the color of sky before snow, and sharp as anything he'd seen in a long time. That's fine, he meant it. I need honest, not fancy. Winter kills pretty folk first out here. She blinked. Something moved through her face. Not softness, not yet. More like a door she'd been holding shut, shifted on its hinges without her permission. She looked at him the way a person looks at something unexpected, suspicious of it maybe, or just not sure what to do with it. What do you want? Direct. No performance, your roof won't hold without proper bracing. Storm coming in 2 weeks, maybe less. He looked at the walls, calculated. You've got the lumber, you've got the nails. You don't have enough hands. I'll manage. You'll manage to build something that falls on you in December. A pause. She wasn't embarrassed. She was thinking, why would you help me? She said. You don't know me. Because I'm tired of liars and nice dresses. He reached down, picked up her hammer where she'd left it against the log pile, tested the weight. The handle was wrapped in cloth strips. Someone had built it down to fit a smaller grip. Someone careful. Someone who planned. She studied him, another moment. Whatever she decided, she kept to herself. Yes, a nod toward a crate near the tent. I can pay with labor. I cook. I mend. Fair enough. He walked to the nearest wall, examined the corner joints. Clean work given what she had to work with. What's your name? Eliza Harris. Ryan Cole. I run cattle 3 miles south. He glanced at the sky. Clouds piling in from the northwest, the light going yellow-gray at the edges. We start tomorrow at first light. She watched him remount and ride back up the slope until the tree line swallowed him. Then she sat down hard on the stump she used as a chopping block. both hands pressed flat on her knees. Not shaking, just needing something solid under them for a moment. First snow in 2 weeks. First stranger who'd looked at her face and kept talking. She wasn't sure which one scared her more. She picked up the coffee pot and poured herself a cup that had gone cold an hour ago. Drank it anyway. Ryan was there before the light the next morning. He didn't announce himself. His horse was tied at the tree line and he was already examining the lumber stacks when Eliza came out of the tent, coffee in hand, hair still half down. She stopped, looked at him. He looked back. "Morning," he said. "You're early. Son doesn't care." She went back inside for the second cup. When she came out and handed it to him, he drank it without commenting that it was the strongest coffee he'd had since a cattle drive years back. Which was a compliment he kept to himself, because she didn't seem like someone who needed compliments. She seemed like someone who needed to get the roof framed before the next cold front. They started on the north wall brace. The rhythm found itself by mid-morning. She measured without a ruler the second time, eyeballed it and cut, and the joint fit clean. He noticed. Didn't say anything. She noticed him noticing. Neither of them said anything about that either. This was, Ryan thought, the most comfortable he'd been around another person in approximately 2 years. That was a thought he filed away and didn't examine. Third day, mid-morning, Ryan was fitting a crossbeam when he heard a wagon coming up the track faster than the terrain warranted. He looked up. Eliza on the ground sorting nails by size, because she was the kind of person who sorted nails by size, looked up too. The wagon was driven by a woman built like a retired schoolteacher who'd given up patience as a bad habit. Dorothy Vance. 45, gray-streaked hair pinned in a bun that was losing the argument with the wind. She ran the boarding house in Crestfall and had, as far as Ryan could tell, never once passed information without also attaching her opinion to it. She pulled up, looked at Eliza, looked up at Ryan on the scaffolding, looked back at Eliza. "Well?" Her voice carried the particular flatness of someone cataloging information for later distribution. "This should be interesting, Mrs. Vance." Eliza's voice was neutral. "Did you need something?" "Brought dried goods. And some cornbread." Dorothy's eyes went back up to Ryan briefly. "And news." "But the news can wait." She set the brake on the wagon and climbed down with the basket. Handed it to Eliza, leaned in just enough to add quietly, "He's been here 3 days and half the town already knows. Half the town can mind its own business." "They won't," Dorothy said it pleasantly. "They never do. But that's not a reason not to do the thing worth doing." She patted Eliza's arm once, efficiently, and climbed back up. Gathered her reins, looked up at Ryan again with an expression that was impossible to read. "Mr. Cole, Mrs. Vance." She drove away. Eliza looked up at Ryan. He looked down at her. "She means well," Eliza said. "Mostly," Ryan agreed. Eliza almost smiled. Almost. She picked up the nail bucket and went back to sorting. The cold had settled in properly. Their breath came in small clouds. The walls were up solid, the corner joints done right. Ryan had checked each one twice. They were working on the roof frame now, the harder part, the part that required 2 people who knew how to anticipate each other without a lot of talking. They'd figured that out faster than Ryan expected. He was sawing when Eliza spoke. Not to him specifically. The way people speak when they've been holding something long enough that it just comes out. Thomas used to drink. She was holding a beam steady, eyes on the wood. Started after we lost our first. Got mean when he drank. A pause. Not for effect, she was thinking about how much to say. That last night he came home. Lamp was on the table. He knocked it over during the fight. She didn't say what the fight was about. She didn't need to. I tried to pull him out. Even then, even after, she stopped. Started again differently. The fire moved faster than I expected. Ryan kept his hands working. Didn't stop, didn't shift toward her, didn't make the moment into something it didn't need to be. Just listened. Town buried him a hero. Her voice was flat, not bitter. Just the flatness of a fact that had been looked at so many times it had worn smooth. Said I must have wanted him dead. Easier than admitting their church deacon beat his wife. She touched the scar once, automatic, then dropped her hand. I bought this claim with everything I had left. Figured if I was going to be alone, I might as well be alone on my own terms. He set down the saw. My wife wanted things I couldn't give her. He looked at the mountains, the way they sat against the gray sky, like they'd been there before all of it, and would be there after. Status. People admiring her at dances. She wasn't wrong to want those things. They just weren't things I had. He looked at a knot in the wood grain. She died 2 years back, childbirth. Baby didn't make it either. Eliza said nothing. Waited, my first thought. Standing at her grave, he stopped. Started again. My first thought was that I was free. The admission sat there between them in the cold air. Been hating myself for that ever since. That doesn't make you a bad man. Her voice was quiet. Certain, it makes you a man who knew the truth before he was ready to say it out loud. He looked at her. She was looking at the mountains too now. Her profile scarred side toward him, which he'd started to notice she did deliberately with some people, and deliberately didn't do with others, was still and calm. Town widows circle me like buzzards, he said. All performance, no help. I'm drowning in women who want to be Mrs. Cole and don't want to be my partner. She nodded, not in sympathy, in recognition. So this arrangement is practical, he said. Agreed. They shook hands again the way they had at the beginning. Her grip was the same as it had been that first afternoon, firm, calloused. Didn't look away. We'll start on the roof beam supports tomorrow, he said, and picked the saw back up. It was Dorothy who brought the warning, because it was always Dorothy who brought the warnings. She showed up the following Thursday with a crate of winter vegetables, and a look on her face that she wore when she was deciding how much to say and in what order. Fitzgerald's been talking, she told Eliza. Ryan was on the upper scaffolding. Dorothy's voice was low enough that he'd have to work to hear it, which meant she'd calculated exactly how loud to speak and chosen this volume on purpose. Says you're bewitching Cole into neglecting his ranch. I haven't set foot on his ranch. That's not the point, and you know it. Dorothy set down the crate and straightened up. Reverend Holt nodded along at the last service. When Holt nods along, things get official. Eliza kept stacking the nails she'd sorted. Her hands didn't stop. What does Fitzgerald actually want? Dorothy looked at her with the patience of someone who'd been watching people pretend not to know obvious things for 45 years. You know what he wants? She did. She'd known since the second week after Thomas died, when Fitzgerald showed up at her door with his oily smile and his talk about how a woman alone wasn't safe, how he could offer her honest work at the boarding house, how the land was really too much for one person to manage. She'd said no. He'd come back. She'd said no again. The rumors had started the third week. He wants the land, Eliza said. He wants the creek on your land, Dorothy corrected. There's a difference. The creek is why the land matters. He's been trying to buy the water rights on this section for 2 years. Thomas kept refusing. And then Thomas, she stopped. Something careful in her voice now. He thought he'd get it easily after. Eliza's hands stilled for one moment, then kept moving. From the scaffolding above them, Ryan's voice came down even and unhurried. She'll fight. Dorothy looked up at him, reassessing something silently. Yes, she said. I believe she will. She picked up her basket. I'm telling you both because you need to know who you're dealing with. Fitzgerald doesn't just want to inconvenience you. He wants the land clean, which means he needs Eliza's reputation clean gone first. She pulled her coat straighter. Good day. She drove away. Ryan came down off the scaffolding. He picked up his coffee cup, found it cold, drank it anyway. There's more, he said. Eliza looked at him, the letter Holt sent. The one I read at the start of last week. He set the cup down. There was a line about testimony. Legal testimony, not just church talk. Holt offered to appear as character witness against you if it came to a county hearing. The cold settled differently now, not weather cold. Something with more weight to it. County hearing for what? She asked, though she could already feel the shape of the answer. Arson, he said it plainly, because she'd asked plainly and she deserved plainly. If Fitzgerald can get 3 witnesses to testify that you set the fire deliberately, and in this territory, a Bort clerk can help arrange that the land reverts to county control. And county control in Crestfall means whoever Fitzgerald's already paid. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the wind shifted and the tent canvas flapped once, loud, and neither of them moved. You knew this when you read the letter. Yes. Why didn't you tell me then? He was quiet for a moment. I didn't want to scare you off the work a beat. That was wrong. She looked at him steadily. Measuring something, I don't scare, she said. I know that now. He picked up his hammer. We've got 2 hours of light left. Let's use them. That evening he stayed later than usual after Eliza had gone into the tent. He sat by the outside fire, reviewing what he knew and what he needed to find out. Fitzgerald had been planning this longer than anyone realized. The letter from Holt was the visible piece, but behind it was a lawyer from Cheyenne named Gerald Sutton, who had appeared in town 10 days ago, asking questions at the hotel and the general store and the livery about the night Thomas Harris died. Not asking about the land directly. Asking about the woman, he'd gotten that information from his contact in the Territorial Land Office. A letter he hadn't mentioned to Eliza yet. He had also, in that letter, received 2 pages on Sutton's prior work. Colorado Territory, 1877, a land dispute resolved in his client's favor through manufactured character testimony against the property holder. Nebraska, 1879, a similar case, thrown out when a witness changed his story. Sutton had lost his territorial license for a year after Nebraska. He'd been working again for 18 months. The pattern was clear. Character first, then land, and Eliza had already given Sutton the raw material he needed: a scar, a dead husband, 2 years of town gossip about a cursed woman. Ryan looked at the dark cabin walls, at the work they'd done together, at the clean joints and the solid corners and the tarp that had held through the first snow without losing a single lashing. He needed to tell her all of it. He would. Tonight he sat with the weight of it, and the fire burned down, and the Wyoming sky wheeled overhead, patient and enormous, indifferent to the small human arrangements happening beneath it. The blizzard hit that weekend without enough warning. They were up on the roof frame, Eliza measuring and Ryan fitting, when the sky went the wrong color, not the normal gray of a coming storm, but something yellowish and flat. The kind of light that meant the storm wasn't an hour out. It was 20 minutes out. Too late to ride back, Ryan said. Eliza looked at the horizon and didn't argue, because there was nothing to argue. The wind was already picking up hard. Snow was starting, not the gentle kind. They got down off the scaffolding fast. He secured the tarp over the unfinished section, lashing it to the wall joists with extra rope because otherwise the wind would take it. She had the fire going inside by the time he got the last lashing tied. The cabin walls cut the wind, the tarp overhead held. The fire was small but enough. 1 blanket. They both looked at it at the same time. "I'll sit by the fire," Ryan said. "That's not practical." Her voice was matter of fact. "It's going to be below 0 by midnight. Then I'll keep the fire high. We have enough wood for 4 hours at that rate." She picked up the blanket and sat down on her bedroll, back against the south wall. She held one edge out toward him. "Don't make it complicated." He sat down against the same wall, 6 inches between them, the blanket across both their shoulders. They sat in silence while the blizzard hit full force outside. The cabin walls flexed slightly in the bigger gusts, but held because they'd built them right, because she'd measured twice and he'd checked every joint, because the work was good. "You have books in that pack," Ryan said. She looked at him sideways, then reached into the canvas pack beside her and produced a book cover warped and water-damaged, spine repaired with braided twine she'd stitched herself. He could tell by the particular tightness of the knots. The Odyssey. She turned it over in her hands. This and 2 others survived the fire. Everything else burned. She opened it to a marked page. "Can you read?" "Barely. No shame in it. Just fact. Never had much schooling. Ranching came earlier. I could teach you. I'd like that." She began reading aloud. Penelope waiting. Odysseus gone long enough to become a story instead of a man. Her voice was low and even, and she gave the words room to be what they were. She didn't perform the text. She inhabited it. The way a person reads something they've read 100 times and still find new things in it. Ryan listened the way he rode fence line. Completely. Nothing held back. Around the point where she was voicing Penelope's suitors making themselves comfortable in the great hall, she pointed to a line and looked at him. He tried to sound it out. He got through most of it. Hit the name, Telemachus, and stopped cold. Tele. He stopped again, looked at the word. "This is a test, it's a name, it's a trap is what it is." "Try again." He tried again, got closer. Eliza covered her mouth with her hand, shoulders shaking. Not laughing at him or maybe a little at him, but the kind that wasn't unkind. It was the laugh of someone who'd forgotten they were capable of it. Surprised by her own amusement, Ryan looked at her. He forgot what word he'd been working on. She composed herself, cleared her throat. "Again," she said. "Prim, professional." "Absolutely not hiding a smile, ma'am," he said in a tone that suggested this was unreasonable, and tried again. Around midnight, the storm howling in full, Eliza's head dropped against his shoulder. He felt her go still, deeply asleep, the kind of tired that wins without warning. He didn't move, didn't shift. Just sat there in the dark with the fire banked low and the blizzard outside and her weight against his shoulder, and thought about nothing in particular for the first time in 2 years. At dawn she stirred. felt where she was, went very still. He kept looking at the dying fire. After a moment, "The fire needs wood, I'll get it," he said. He stood up carefully, went to the woodpile, started adding logs. When he turned back, she was sitting up straight, hair loose, watching the new flames catch. He stepped outside to check the chimney drawer, and stopped horse tracks in the snow. Fresh, recent. A single horse, circling the cabin close enough to see through the window gap in the canvas tarp. The tracks went around twice, came from the direction of the south trail, and left back the same way. Someone had been out here in a blizzard. Standing outside in the dark, watching through a gap in the canvas, Ryan crouched and looked at the tracks more carefully. Shod horse. Careful stride controlled, not rushing. This wasn't a lost rider. This was someone who knew exactly where they were going and had come here deliberately. He stood up, looked at the tracks leading south. Toward Crestfall, toward Fitzgerald's operation. He didn't tell Eliza right away. He came back inside, added more wood, accepted the cup she handed him without comment. They ate breakfast cold cornbread from Dorothy's basket, dried beef, the last of the coffee. They talked about the work plan for the day, but she read something in his face she couldn't quite name. She waited until they were outside, checking the tarp damage from the storm. "What did you see?" she said. He told her about the tracks. She listened without moving. When he finished, she looked toward the south trail for a long moment. Then she looked back at the cabin, at the window gaps, the canvas tarp, the things visible through the openings if someone stood close enough. "So there's a witness," she said. "To nothing in particular. But Fitzgerald doesn't need particular. He needs impression." "Yes," she picked up her hammer. "Then we'd better get the windows fitted today, not because it would stop what was coming." They both knew that, because it was the next thing that needed doing. The following Sunday, Reverend Holt rode up with 2 men from the church elder board and a letter. He came just as the afternoon light was going long and gold across the half-finished shutters. Ryan heard them, first 3 horses on the south track. Moving with the deliberate pace of an official visit, he came down off the ladder. Eliza set down the plane she'd been using on a window frame and stood beside him. The Reverend was thin in the way of men who wore severity as clothing. Black coat, black hat, the kind of face that had settled into permanent judgment so long ago it no longer noticed it was doing it. The 2 elders flanked him, both men Ryan recognized from town, both men whose livelihood touched Fitzgerald's interests in one way or another. The letter was addressed Ryan. Holt handed it down from horseback. Ryan read it, folded it, handed it back. "Tell Fitzgerald to come himself if he has something to say." Holt's expression suggested he'd expected protest of a different kind. Protest, he could answer, scriptures ready. This flat refusal to engage wasn't in his prepared remarks, Brother Cole. He tried again with the older tone, the one from the pulpit, sonorous, patient with sinners. "This woman is known to us. Her history is—" "I know her history." Ryan's voice was even. "I know more of it than you do." Holt looked at Eliza. That look. The one that categorized and sentenced in the same movement. The one she'd been receiving from strangers since the fire. She met it head on. Didn't lower her gaze. Didn't explain herself. Just looked back at him with the same calm attention she'd give a piece of timber she was assessing. Holt did not expect that either. He gathered the reins, turned his horse, and the 3 of them rode back south. At the edge of the tree line he paused and looked back once. Ryan had already turned back to the work. Eliza was already planing the window frame again. The sound of the plane on wood was steady, even. The Reverend rode on. That evening Ryan sat by the outside fire after Eliza had gone to sleep. He'd meant to ride back to the ranch an hour ago. He was still sitting there. The letter from Fitzgerald had used the usual language: reputation, community standards, the welfare of women in need of proper protection. But there'd been a sentence near the end he'd read 3 times and put away. In the absence of clear property documentation, the county is empowered to review the original claim submission but property documentation. The original claim, Ryan had seen the county land records once, years back, during his own boundary dispute with a neighbor. He knew what that kind of language meant when a lawyer wrote it. It meant someone had already been to the county office. It meant the documentation review wasn't a threat, it was already in motion. He sat with that for a while. The fire burning down. The night clear and cold and full of stars over the open roof section, 80 acres. South-facing slope, early snowmelt, creek on the eastern boundary, year-round water, strong flow even in August. He'd ridden past this land a dozen times without thinking much about it. Now he was thinking hard about it. The creek fed south, and south was where Fitzgerald's proposed freight route ran, the one he'd been developing for 3 years, the one that needed reliable water access at the northern end of the valley to make the winter operation viable. Without this water, the route was summer only. With it, Fitzgerald became the most important commercial operation in 3 counties. Thomas Harris had refused to sell 3 times, and then Thomas Harris was dead and his widow was alone, and the land should have been easy to acquire one way or another. Except the widow hadn't been easy. She'd bought the land outright, filed the papers herself, moved out here and started building. She'd turned down every avenue Fitzgerald had given her. So now he was using Holt and Sutton and manufactured testimony. Ryan stood up, kicked dirt over the fire's edge to bank it for the night. He rode back to the ranch in the dark, the cold sharp in his lungs. At the kitchen table, he spread out the land records he kept in the drawer and found the survey section covering Eliza's claim, traced the creek line with his finger. Then he found the application Fitzgerald had filed with the county water board in the spring, obtained months ago, because Ryan Cole made it his business to know what was happening with land in this valley. He set the 2 documents side by side. The creek on her land was annotated on Fitzgerald's application as water source, pending acquisition. Pending. He'd written it into his own filing as if it were already done, as if the acquisition were a formality, as if the woman on that land were a detail to be handled, not a person who'd built something real with her own hands and paid for it with the last of what she had. Ryan picked up a pencil, found a piece of paper, wrote 1 line, crossed it out, wrote it differently. He wasn't writing a letter to anyone in particular yet. He was writing the beginning of understanding what he was going to have to do, and when, and how much it was going to cost him in the currency of this town's opinion, which he'd always told himself didn't matter, and which he'd been lying about, because it had always mattered just enough to make him careful, just enough to make him quiet when quiet was the wrong thing to be. He looked at what he'd written. Looked at pending acquisition in Fitzgerald's ink. Then he put the pencil down and started writing in earnest, because there were things he needed to find out and people he needed to contact and moves to make before Sutton finished building the case that was already in motion 20 miles north of where Ryan was sitting. 3 miles away, Eliza Harris was probably awake. She didn't sleep well. He'd noticed that over weeks of working beside her. She was probably lying in the dark, going through her own accounting of what was coming and how to meet it. She'd meet it head on. He already knew that. The question was whether she'd have to meet it alone. He thought about her voice reading Penelope, the way she'd said even then, even after, and stopped herself and started again differently. The scar she touched without knowing she was touching it. The habit of years of other people's eyes going there first. The grip of her hand when they shook. The laugh she'd covered with her palm, surprised by herself. The way she'd said, "I don't scare," and meant it as simple fact. Not bravado. Fact. He turned the pencil in his fingers. Then he started writing the letter to Marcus Webb in Cheyenne, because a man who prepares well is harder to defeat than a man who reacts. And Eliza Harris had already prepared better than anyone knew, and the least Ryan Cole could do was make sure she didn't have to fight the next part by herself. Outside, the Wyoming stars were out in full, cold and clear and patient, there before all of this and there long after, watching the small human arrangements beneath them, with the particular indifference of things that have seen everything and are surprised by none of it. Word count, 3,847, section breakdown complete. Sections 1-5 delivered for Part 1. Minimum target requires continuation. Proceeding with remaining Part 1 content now. The morning after Holt's visit, Eliza was on the roof before Ryan arrived. He pulled up and found her already there, straddling the ridgeline in the gray pre-dawn, checking the top lashings from the blizzard. She had a rope tied around her waist and anchored to the north wall post, the precaution you take when there's no one there to catch you if you slip. He tied his horse. Climbed the ladder without commentary. "The east section held better than I thought," she said, not looking up from the joint she was checking. "The brace you added on Tuesday made the difference. The cutting you did made the brace possible." She handed him the end of a lashing that needed retying. He took it. They worked in silence through the gray morning light, moving across the roof with the careful coordination of people who'd learned each other's movements over weeks of shared work. Below them, the view opened up when the mist thinned. the meadow going amber-brown with frost, the creek glinting on the eastern boundary catching what little light there was, persistent, clear, year-round water. He'd grown up knowing what that meant in this part of Wyoming. "You know why Fitzgerald wants this specific piece," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd worked that out the night before. She kept her hands on the lashing. "The creek? He's got a freight route planned. Needs year-round water at the northern end of the valley to run it through winter. This creek is the only reliable source on the eastern slope that doesn't freeze out." He tested the knot, found it solid. Without this land, his route runs May through October. With it, he runs year-round, the difference between a local operation and a territory-wide one. Thomas knew, her voice was careful, even. "He told me the second time Fitzgerald came. Said he'd never sell because he knew what it would mean. Fitzgerald controlling the water meant Fitzgerald controlling everyone who needed the water, which was everyone in this valley eventually." She looked at the creek below. "I thought he was being stubborn about the money. He was being stubborn about the right thing." Ryan said nothing for a moment. "Your husband wasn't wrong about that." "No." A pause. "He wasn't wrong about everything." He understood what she meant. That Thomas Harris had been a man who'd had true things in him and broken things in him, and the two had lived together uneasily until the night they couldn't anymore. That grief for someone like that was complicated because you weren't just grieving the person, you were grieving the version of them that existed before the drinking, and the life you thought you were building that turned out to be something else entirely. He understood that kind of grief specifically. "The arson charge," he said. "Dorothy told you what Sutton's been doing in town?" "Yes, he's been there 10 days. That's long enough to have found witnesses already, or built them." He chose the next words carefully. "This isn't going away with the cabin finished. Even when the work's done here, you're going to need to deal with what's coming at the county level." She looked at him directly. "I know, I have money, plain, no performance around it. And I have a name in this county that carries weight in a courtroom, which I've never had to use because I've never needed it. I'm saying I can use it now." She was quiet for long enough that the wind picked up and then settled again. "Why?" Not suspicious. Genuinely asking, "Because it's the right thing." He looked at the creek. "And because Fitzgerald's had things go his way in this county for too long, and someone's going to have to be the one who makes the math not work out for him." "That's not a personal reason." He looked back at her. She was watching him with those gray-blue eyes that didn't give anything away unless she decided to give it. "No," he said. "It's not just that." She waited. He didn't have the words for the rest of it yet. Or he had them, but they were too early and too much, and the kind of thing that would tip the arrangement into something different before it was ready. "Let me find out more about Sutton," he said. "I know someone in Cheyenne who knows the territorial courts. If Sutton's worked this kind of case before manufactured testimony, paid clerks, there'll be a record." She studied him for another moment. Then she nodded once. "All right, but I'm not a charity case," she said. "I know that. I'll pay back whatever it costs. It'll take time. I know that too." She made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been something else. They finished checking the tarp in silence. The morning light was coming up properly now, pale and flat through thin cloud cover. The kind of light that made everything look like a photograph of itself. Below, the cabin walls stood solid. Straight lines, clean corners. Good work, both of them. The weeks passed in the rhythm of building. Eliza plastered the gaps between the logs while Ryan fitted the shutters. She was precise with the plaster, forcing it deep into each gap with the heel of her palm, smoothing the surface flush. He watched her work from the corner of his eye while he measured the shutter hinges, and thought that whoever had taught her that technique was good at their craft. He'd started noticing things like that. The quality of her skills, where they'd come from and what they said about who she'd been before fire and the widow years and the cabin alone on the slope. She'd been someone who built things. Before and after, in the evenings, the books came out. She was systematic about teaching him to read, didn't let him skip over the hard words, didn't accept his attempts to bluff past words he almost knew. He started keeping a small piece of paper in his coat pocket, wrote down words he'd learned during the day. At night, she'd test him. He'd get most of them right, miss one or two. She'd correct him without ceremony and move on. He was learning faster than either of them mentioned. One evening, she'd been choosing which section to read, and she'd pulled out the worn Bible smaller than the Odyssey, held together with the same careful stitching as the other book's spine. She'd turned it over in her hands once and put it back without opening it. "Church book?" he asked. "Used to be." She chose the Odyssey again. "I still believe most of it. I just stopped trusting the people who decided what it meant." He thought about Reverend Holt, about Harold Harris, the church deacon who'd beaten his wife and been buried with honor, about the particular corruption of using sacred things as cover for ordinary cruelty. "Seems like God and the church don't always agree," he said. She looked at him. Then something in her face relaxed slightly, a recognition of someone else who'd thought about this and reached a similar uncomfortable place. "No," she said. "They don't." She opened the Odyssey to the marked page and began to read. He listened. He thought about the letter he'd gotten back from his contact in Cheyenne, 2 pages, closely written. Sutton's history. 2 prior cases in Colorado Territory and 1 in Nebraska. Both times the same pattern. A land dispute, a character charge against a woman, manufactured witnesses. 1 case had succeeded. 1 had been thrown out when a witness changed testimony. The 3rd case in Nebraska had resulted in Sutton losing his territorial license for a year. He'd been working again for 18 months. Ryan had the letter folded in his coat pocket. He'd tell Eliza tomorrow. Tonight she was reading about Penelope and her suitors and the long patience of waiting for something real, and the fire was warm and her voice was steady and clear. He let the night be what it was. Later, much later, he'd remember this particular evening. The fire, the book, her voice. The way she read the word home like it meant something specific to her, and she'd stopped being aware she was reading aloud and was just inside the story. That was the evening he understood. Clearly and without any possibility of arguing himself out of it, that the arrangement had become something else. He didn't say that. Not then, but he knew. He sat with the knowing, the way you sit with a thing that's too large to deal with in a single night, that has to be approached slowly, that deserves more care than he'd given to most careful things in his life. Outside in the dark tree line somewhere south of the cabin, and back far enough to be invisible, a horse stood still, patient, watching the warm light through the window. And the man who held the reins took note of what he saw and turned south toward Crestfall, and rode back to tell Amos Fitzgerald that the situation had not resolved itself the way they'd hoped. Have you ever been judged by people who never once asked for your side of the story? Stay with us, because what Fitzgerald is about to do to this woman will make your blood run cold. Dorothy Vance arrived on a Tuesday with winter squash, dried apples, and the specific expression she wore when she was delivering information she wished she didn't have. Eliza saw the expression first. Before the squash, before the apples, that expression had a shape she'd learned to read over the past month, the slight press of Dorothy's lips. The way her eyes went to the cabin walls instead of to Eliza's face. When she climbed down from the wagon, "He sent a lawyer," Dorothy said. No preamble. No easing in, Gerald Sutton. Came from Cheyenne 3 days ago. Been asking questions at the hotel, at the general store, at the livery. She set the squash down on the workbench with more care than squash usually required. He's not asking about the land directly. He's asking about the night of the fire. Eliza kept her hands on the piece of fence rail she'd been sanding. Kept moving. Smooth strokes. Even pressure. Who's he been talking to? Ed Marsh, the Cooley brothers. Widow Prentice. Dorothy's voice was deliberate. Each name placed like evidence. People who were in town that night. People who Fitzgerald employs in one form or another. People who'll say what they're paid to say. People who'll say what they're afraid not to say. Dorothy finally looked at her directly. There's a difference. Ed Marsh isn't a bad man. He's a man with a grain contract and 3 children. Fitzgerald holds that contract. Eliza set down the rail, stood up straight, looked at the mountains the way she did when she was arranging things in her head, sorting, the way she sorted nails by size and weight and what each one was for. Arson, she said. That's what Sutton's building toward. If arson sticks, the land reverts to county control. Dorothy didn't soften it. She wasn't a woman who softened things as a policy. And the county clerk is Harmon Dale, who has been in Fitzgerald's pocket since before Thomas died. The wind moved through the pines above the cabin, a sound like water, like something patient. Ryan needs to know, Eliza said. Ryan already knows. Dorothy's voice shifted, something more careful in it now, watching. He got a letter back from Cheyenne yesterday. About Sutton's history. Eliza went still. He didn't tell me. No, why not? Dorothy picked up her basket, put it down again. The closest she ever came to hesitation. I think he's trying to figure out how to tell you without it sounding like he's taken over the problem, which is a consideration that wouldn't occur to most men, so I'm inclined to give him some credit for trying. A beat. Even if the execution is lacking. Eliza looked at the fence rail, the smooth section she'd been working on, the rough section still ahead. So he knew, he'd known and he'd sat with the knowing and hadn't found the words yet. That was she didn't know what that was. Not a betrayal, not quite. Something more human than that. Something she understood from the inside. She picked up the rail again. "Tell him to come," she said. Today he came that afternoon. She was on the roof checking the last shingle section when his horse appeared at the tree line. She didn't come down. He saw her up there, tied his horse, came to the base of the ladder. "Dorothy talked to you," he said. "Dorothy talks to everyone. That's what Dorothy does." She fitted the shingle she was holding, checked the overlap. "Come up." He climbed. They sat on the ridgeline in the thin December sun, which gave light but no warmth the way promises sometimes did. "Tell me what Sutton's file says," she said. He told her. All of it. Colorado, Nebraska, the pattern the same sequence each time. Character first, then land. The year he'd lost his license. The 18 months he'd been working again since. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a silence that had texture, not emptiness, but the sound of a person thinking hard. "He's done this before and won once," she said. "Yes, so he knows what works. He knows what worked in Colorado in 1877. This isn't Colorado and it isn't 1877. He turned the information over, looking for the edge that cut in their favor. And he lost the Nebraska case when a witness changed testimony. Someone got to that witness first. Someone who knew what to say." Eliza looked at him. "Are you suggesting we find whoever's wavering and talk to them first?" "I'm suggesting we find Ben Watts." She went still. The name hadn't come up in any of their conversations. She looked at Ryan with the particular attention she gave to things she was measuring. "The blacksmith," she said. "He was passing your road that night. I know because he told me so. 2 months after Thomas died, when he came to shoe my horses. He mentioned it in passing, said he'd seen the fire from the road, said he'd thought about stopping, but by the time he pulled up the roof was already gone." Ryan looked at the creek below. He didn't say what else he saw. But a man who mentions being on that road on that particular night mentions it for a reason. He never came forward. No, why not? Because nobody asked him the right question. He looked back at her. And because in this town, volunteering information that contradicts what Fitzgerald wants people to believe has consequences. Eliza was quiet for a long moment. Below them, a hawk moved across the meadow in long, slow circles, riding something invisible. Then it dropped and was gone. "If Sutton's already been 10 days building this case," she said, "a hearing could be set for early January or sooner. Fitzgerald's moving fast." He paused. "I have a lawyer, Marcus Webb, Cheyenne. Small man, looks harmless. Best territorial land attorney I've ever seen work a room. I want to bring him up here. How much? Doesn't matter, Ryan." "It matters to me," he said. "It doesn't matter in the way you mean. I have the money and the reason," and he stopped. "Reorganized. It's the right thing to do and I want to do it. Let me." She looked at him. The way she looked at joints and beams before she committed weight to them. "For a long time, I'll pay you back," she said. "Yes, eventually. When you're ready." He held her gaze. "That's not why I'm doing it." She looked away first, which was unusual. Below, the hawk had disappeared into the grass and didn't come back up. "I'll talk to Ben Watts myself," she said. "He might not, he'll talk to me." Her voice was certain, not arrogant. The certainty of someone who'd learned to read people the way Ryan read weather. He didn't stop because he didn't care. He didn't stop because he didn't know what stopping would cost him. Those are different things. I can talk to a man who cares. Ryan thought about that. Thought about her sitting across a fire from him for weeks, reading Homer out loud, teaching him words one at a time, never once making him feel small for not knowing them. He believed her. "All right," he said. She stood up on the ridgeline, balanced without the rope anchor she sometimes used, easy as walking flat ground. "The west shingles need 2 more nails each," she said. "The wind gets under them on that side." He got the nail bag. They finished the roof in silence. The kind that meant everything was understood and nothing needed repeating. She went to see Ben Watts the next morning, alone. Before Ryan arrived for the day's work, the Watts smithy was at the south end of Crest Falls Main Street, a big log building. Always warm, always smelling of hot metal and horse. Ben Watts was 60-something and had the arms of a man who'd been swinging a hammer since before Ryan Cole was born. He was not a man who talked much. He was not a man who spoke to widows with scarred faces in the middle of a town that had settled opinions about such women. He was, however, alone in his smithy at 7 in the morning when Eliza Harris walked in and stood in front of his forge. He looked up, looked at her, kept his tongs on the piece he was working. Miss Harris, careful. Neutral, Mr. Watts, she didn't ease in. She'd decided on the ride down that direct was the only thing that would work with a man like him. You were on my road the night of the fire. The tongs didn't move. His expression didn't move. You said so yourself, she continued. To Ryan Cole, 2 months after, he told me. A long pause. The forge hissed, metal cooling in the bucket beside him. I saw smoke, he said finally. Pulled up. Roof was already gone. What else did you see? The tongs came down on the bench. He picked up a rag, wiped his hands slowly, taking his time with it, the way a man takes time when he's deciding something. Sutton's been in town, he said, not answering her question. Answering a different one, I know. He came to see me Tuesday. Watts folded the rag, set it down. Wants me to say I saw you running from the fire, that you were outside before it started. Were you going to say that? His jaw set. No, what were you going to say? He looked at her directly for the first time since she'd walked in. The look of a man who'd been carrying something uncomfortable for a while and had begun to feel the weight of it in his back and his sleep. I was going to say nothing, he said. Like I have been, I know. She kept her voice even. Not cold, just accurate. I'm not angry at you for it. I understand what it costs a man in this town to say things Fitzgerald doesn't want, said, a pause. But they're filing arson charges. That's not gossip anymore. That's a hearing before a judge. And 3 men who work for Fitzgerald will testify I set the fire deliberately. Watts was quiet. The forge made its steady sound behind him. What did you see? She asked again. Quiet, patient. The way she held beams while Ryan hammered steady, without shaking, without demanding anything except honesty. He looked at the floor, at the forge. At something past both of them, I saw Harold, he said, in the doorway. He had hold of you. You were pulling away from him and he pulled you back inside. He stopped. Picked the rag up, put it down again. I didn't stop because I thought I don't know what I thought. I thought it was a domestic matter. I thought it wasn't my place. He looked at her face, at the scar, at what it said about domestic matters and places. I was wrong. The smithy was quiet except for the forge. I don't need you to fix the past, Eliza said. I need you to tell the truth in a hearing room, a beat. I need you to tell it for yourself, not for me. He looked at her for a long time. A man doing arithmetic on something that had nothing to do with numbers. When's the hearing? He said. She told Ryan about Watts that evening. She told him the way she told him most important things straight. No arrangement, the facts in order. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He'll do it, he said. He'll do it if it gets to a hearing room. The question is whether Fitzgerald knows Watts talked and moves to stop it before then. Fitzgerald can't stop a man from testifying. Not legally. Fitzgerald doesn't always work legally. Ryan looked at her. She looked back. Both of them understanding what that meant without wanting to say it plainly, that a man like Fitzgerald, running out of legal options, might find other ways to discourage an inconvenient witness. I'll send for Webb tomorrow, Ryan said, and I'll mention to Samuel Briggs that Ben Watts might appreciate some company in his smithy for the next few weeks. Samuel's one man, Samuel's worth 4 men. And he has 3 sons who work for me, and like Ben Watts personally, he stood up from the workbench. Nobody's going to touch him, she nodded. Something in her shoulders settled, not all the way, not yet, but enough. There's one more thing, she said. He waited. Dorothy thinks the hearing could be set before Christmas. Fitzgerald's been pushing Sutton to move fast before the weather makes travel difficult, before Webb can get up here from Cheyenne, before, she stopped, reorganized. Before you have time to prepare, I know. He picked up his coat from the peg she'd put in the wall specifically for coats, because she thought about things like that. That's why I'm writing Webb tonight and sending the letter with the morning stage. He buttoned up, moved to the door. How's your wood supply? She blinked at the change of direction. Enough for 3 weeks. I'll bring another cord Saturday. He paused at the door. The stove's drawing unevenly. I noticed it Tuesday, probably a partial blockage in the flue pipe. I'll check it when I bring the wood. Ryan, he stopped. Thank you, she said. Not performative, just accurate. He nodded once, went out. She stood in the finished cabin door hung, windows sealed, chimney drawing smoke into the cold night, and listened to his horse move off through the dark. The walls were solid, every beam and joint. She wondered when she'd stopped thinking of this place as the cabin and started thinking of it as home. Dangerous, that, or maybe not. Maybe that was the whole point of building something yourself. 3 days before Christmas, Ryan came for her differently than usual. He rode up mid-morning at a pace that told her something had changed before he'd said a word. She was turning the garden plot she'd been planning for spring frozen ground, hard work, breaking through the frost crust with a pickaxe because she needed to believe in April, even in December. She stood up when she heard him. Looked at his face. Hearing's been set, she said. Not a question. January 2nd, he dismounted. Sutton moved faster than I thought. 3 witnesses filed affidavits yesterday. Ed Marsh. The Cooley brothers, Marsh and the Cooleys, yes. And Widow Prentice. He tied his horse to the post. Prentice says she was at your door that evening and saw you outside the house while the lamp was still burning inside. Eliza went still. Widow Prentice had lived 4 houses from the Harris home. Eliza had brought her soup twice when she was sick the winter before the fire. She'd sat with her in the months after, when nobody else in Crestfall would sit with the woman they'd decided was a witch. She was afraid, Eliza said, working to keep the thing from her voice that wanted to be there, not anger. Something rawer than anger. She needed the business from Fitzgerald's workers. Her income, Dorothy's boarding house, Ryan corrected gently. Prentice works for Dorothy. The pieces rearrange themselves. Dorothy doesn't know. Dorothy doesn't know yet. She will within the hour. Yes, he looked at her. Are you all right? She thought about Widow Prentice, about soup delivered in January, about what it meant to need something badly enough to say a lie that could destroy a person you'd once been kind to. No, she said. Honest. But I will be. He didn't try to fix it, didn't offer alternatives or arguments, just stood there, present and solid, which was the right thing, and which she noticed precisely because he didn't make a production of it. Webb arrives on the 28th, he said. He'll need to review everything before the hearing. The land records, the survey, the water board application. I have most of it. There's one document I need you to help me locate. What document? Thomas's original purchase agreement. The one with the water rights notation. If we can show the court that Fitzgerald knew about those rights before Thomas died, that he'd been trying to acquire them through purchase, and failed 3 times, it establishes motive. It changes the whole shape of what Sutton's presenting. I have it, she said. He looked at her. I kept everything from the property, papers, surveys, Thomas's correspondence with the county office. I kept them in a tin box. She looked at the cabin. It survived the fire. I brought it with me when I left. Something moved through Ryan's face. Relief maybe, mixed with something like awe. The kind of awe a person feels when they realize someone else was more prepared for the worst than they'd expected. You knew, he said. When you left Crestfall, you already knew you might need them. I knew Fitzgerald would try something eventually. She started toward the cabin. I just didn't know what form it would take. She produced the tin box from beneath a floorboard she'd cut and fitted in the first week she'd been here. He watched her pry up the board, a perfect cut, invisible when the board was down, held in place by its own weight and 2 hidden wooden dowels. He'd walked over that board 100 times without knowing. The box was old, military style, with a latch repaired with a bent nail. Inside, papers folded and organized by date. The purchase agreement on top, March 1878, clear hand, Thomas Harris's signature and the county recorder's seal. And there in the margin, in different ink, in a hand Ryan didn't recognize but would shortly determine was Amos Fitzgerald's owner notation. Water rights, East Creek, disputed per verbal agreement pending, disputed. Fitzgerald had tried to claim the water rights were verbally agreed upon before the sale completed. Thomas had kept the paper with the notation because Thomas knew, on some level, that the notation was a lie and that lies needed documenting. Ryan held the paper and felt the case shift in his hands like a physical thing. This is it, he said. This is what Webb needs. Fitzgerald claimed the water rights were disputed before the land was even sold. He built his route plans on the assumption he'd get them. When he didn't, when Thomas kept refusing, and then Thomas died, and then I refused. Eliza finished, steady. He'd been waiting 4 years for something that was never going to be given to him. And a man who's waited 4 years for something doesn't take the last refusal well. She put the box back, replaced the board, stood up and smoothed her skirt, purely practical, not nervous, and looked at him. Can Webb use it? Webb will use it the way a carpenter uses a level. To show the judge that everything Sutton built is crooked, he folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his coat. "I'll keep this at the ranch." "Locked?" she nodded. Then, because she was Eliza Harris, and she'd learned that things said sideways never landed as clean as things said straight. "What are we doing, Ryan?" He looked at her. "I know what the arrangement was," she said. "Labor for labor. Help before winter. Practical." She looked at her hands, calloused, capable, the hands of someone who'd built things and intended to keep building them. "But I'm not in the habit of letting men spend money on my legal defense for purely practical reasons. And you're not in the habit of riding 3 miles in the middle of the day because a hearing date changed." A pause. "So what are we doing?" He was quiet for a real moment, not the pause of a man avoiding the question, but the pause of a man who'd thought about this and was choosing his words deliberately. "I don't know exactly," he said, "but I know it stopped being just an arrangement somewhere around the second week." He held her gaze. "I know I don't want to stop coming here when the cabin's done. I know I haven't wanted anything in 2 years the way I want." He stopped. "I'm not good with words. You know that better than anyone. You're better than you were 6 weeks ago. Not good enough for this." She looked at him. The straight look, the measuring look, the one that saw past the surface of a thing to what was holding it up underneath. "All right," she said. "Quiet. We'll figure out what it is when we're not fighting a court case. That's fair. It's practical. It's both." Something loosened in the room. Not tension exactly, more like a question that had been hanging in the air had been acknowledged without being forced into an answer it wasn't ready for. She put the coffee pot on. He sat down and they spread the papers from the tin box across the table and started working through what Webb would need, and outside the frozen ground held its frost, and the creek ran on the eastern boundary, and the mountains stood against the sky the way they always did, patient with all of it. Christmas week came cold and clear. Ryan had stopped making the long ride back to the ranch in the evenings. Not because anything had been decided or said aloud. Because there was work to do, reviewing documents, preparing materials for Webb, cataloging the correspondence between Thomas and the county office, and because doing it by firelight together was more efficient than riding 3 miles in the dark and coming back at dawn. This was, they both understood, not entirely about efficiency. He slept in the chair. She slept on her bedroll with her back to the room, which meant her face to the wall, which meant her scar to the room. He'd noticed she'd stopped the particular positioning that put the unmarked side forward. She'd stopped doing it weeks ago, gradually, without ceremony. He didn't say anything about it because she hadn't offered it as a significant gesture, and he wasn't going to make it one. It just meant she'd stopped performing something she didn't owe him in the first place. He found he was glad of that. On Christmas morning, she woke to find something on the table beside the coffee pot. A piece of paper, folded. She opened it. Ryan's handwriting still rough at the edges, some letter forms still finding their shape, but fully legible. He'd written out in his own hand a passage from the Odyssey, the part about Penelope recognizing Odysseus by something only they could know. 3 sentences, written slowly and carefully, corrected in one place where he'd spelled a word wrong, and crossed it out and spelled it right. She sat at the table in the cold pre-dawn and read it 3 times. He was outside checking the horses. She could hear him moving around the post he'd set in the ground to serve as a hitching point. She folded the paper very carefully and put it in the tin box with the property documents. When he came in, she was making breakfast, and she didn't say anything about the paper, and he didn't ask. But something in the room had changed, and they both knew it, and neither of them felt the need to name it yet. Some things were better left to ripen on their own time. New Year's Eve came without ceremony. Ryan was at the ranch for most of the day, animals to tend, hands to check in with, a year of accounts to close that he'd been putting off. He came back to the cabin in the early evening with a bottle of whiskey he'd been given as a gift 3 Christmases ago and never opened. "I don't drink much," he said. "Neither do I." They each had 1 small measure in tin cups and sat on the front step of the cabin in the cold, watching the year go out. The mountains were dark shapes against a sky crowded with stars. The creek on the eastern boundary made its steady sound. Ice at the edges now, but the center still moving, the way water does when it's determined not to stop. "Whatever happens at the hearing," Eliza said. He looked at her. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that this," she gestured, just slightly, at the cabin behind them, at the months of work visible in the walls. at the space between them on the step, which had gotten smaller since October without either of them deciding it would. This was worth it. Whatever it costs, he looked at the mountains, at the creek, at the shape of things that had been built in the dark and cold and were still standing. It's not going to cost you anything, he said. Not after January 2nd, you can't know that? No. He turned the cup in his hands. But I can be pretty sure. A pause. Webb thinks we have it. He thinks once the notation comes in and Dorothy testifies to the ink on Fitzgerald's hands at the recorder's office, Sutton's witnesses fall apart. Hired testimony doesn't hold up once the underlying motive is visible to a judge, and if it doesn't work that way, then we go up to the territorial level and we keep going. His voice was very level. No drama in it, just fact. I have enough money to keep going a long time, Eliza. Fitzgerald does too, but he doesn't have Webb, and he doesn't have a woman who kept her papers in a tin box under a floorboard she cut herself. She made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something more complicated than that. The floorboard took 3 tries to get level, she said. I know. I could tell by the chisel marks. She looked at him. You noticed that? I notice things you make, he said it plainly. No decoration on it. The way you splice rope, the way you pack plaster, the way you measure twice and cut once every single time, even when you know you're right. He looked at his cup. I pay it attention to good work. She was quiet for a moment. A long one. That might be the most honest compliment I've ever received, she said finally. It's not meant as a compliment. It's just true. A meteor crossed the sky. Gone in 2 seconds. Neither of them commented on it. Happy New Year, Ryan Cole, she said. Happy New Year, Eliza Harris. The creek ran on in the dark, patient, persistent, not going anywhere. But what nobody in that town knew was this: Eliza Harris had heard words like just an arrangement before. A different man, the same dismissal. She'd spent 2 years building a life that said she was worth more than that. And in a courtroom 2 days from now, the question of whether she'd been right was about to be answered in front of everyone who'd ever doubted it. Marcus Webb arrived on the 28th, as promised. He was exactly as Ryan had described, small, unremarkable in the way that men who'd spent decades in courtrooms sometimes became, the kind of man nobody looked at twice in a hotel lobby. He had a leather case older than most of the buildings in Crestfall, and eyes that moved over a room the way a surveyor's instrument moved over terrain, measuring everything without appearing to. He reviewed the documents at the cabin table. Ryan sat to his right, Eliza sat across. Dorothy Vance had come uninvited and positioned herself near the stove with a cup of coffee, because Dorothy considered herself a material witness to the general situation, and was not a woman to be moved once she'd decided to be somewhere. Webb read the purchase agreement. Read the margin notation twice. Set it down. How many people know about this notation? 3 people in this room, Eliza said. And whoever was with Fitzgerald when he wrote it, who do you think was with him? Harmon Dale was the county recorder at the time of the sale. Webb's expression didn't change. He had the face of a man who'd stopped being surprised by human corruption sometime in his 30s. Dale is listed as a material party in the hearing request, I know. If we can show Dale was involved in the notation, if we can show that Fitzgerald was trying to create a false record of disputed rights before the sale even completed, Webb picked up the paper again, looked at it closely. This is enough to change the nature of the hearing entirely. From a criminal proceeding against you to a misconduct inquiry against Fitzgerald and Dale, the room was quiet except for the stove ticking in the corner. Can you do that? Ryan asked. I can try. Webb set the document down. But Fitzgerald will see it coming once we present the paper. He'll argue the notation was made afterward, added by Thomas in bad faith. Thomas is dead, Eliza said. Yes. Which means he can't confirm the handwriting isn't his. Webb looked at her directly. Do you know anyone who saw Fitzgerald at the recorder's office in March of 1878? Any witness who can place him there during the sale process? She thought about it. Went through the list of people who'd been in Crestfall in March of 1878 and whom she still trusted to tell the truth, and whom Fitzgerald hadn't yet bought or frightened into silence. Ben Watts, she said. He was repairing the recorder's office door that week. A hinge had come off the frame. He was there every day for 3 days, Dorothy Vance. By the stove, made a small sound. The sound of a woman who had been listening carefully and had just had a thought she hadn't had before. Watts was there? Dorothy said. 3 days. Dorothy set down her coffee cup slowly. Fitzgerald came to the recorder's office twice that week. she said, putting it together piece by piece. I remember because I was at the land office next door renewing my own property registration. I saw Fitzgerald come out of the recorder's office and he had ink on his hand. She looked at her own hand, remembering the specific detail of it. I thought it was odd because Fitzgerald never did his own paperwork. Always had someone else handle the pen. The room went very still. Webb picked up his pen. Mrs. Vance, he said, would you be willing to testify to that at the hearing? Dorothy Vance set down her coffee cup with the deliberate placement of a woman who had been waiting to be asked a useful question for approximately 2 years. Mr. Webb, she said, I have been waiting a long time to be asked exactly that, Webb wrote. Ryan looked at Eliza across the table. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke. Some moments didn't need commentary. 2 days before the hearing, Fitzgerald made his last move. It came not through Sutton and not through Holt. It came through a boy 16, one of the stable hands from the livery, who appeared at the cabin door with an envelope and wouldn't meet Eliza's eyes when she answered. He handed it over and left before she'd finished opening it. Inside, a bank draft, substantial. More money than the land was worth on the open market, because this was not about the open market anymore and they both knew it. And a single line below it in Fitzgerald's own handwriting, final offer. Take it and walk away clean. Refuse and the hearing proceeds. She turned the bank draft over once, looked at the amount, thought about what it would buy a start somewhere else. A clean break from Crestfall and its long memory, a life where nobody knew her face or her history or her name. She put the letter back in the envelope. She carried it to the fireplace and held the corner of it in the flame until it caught. Let it burn down to the grate without watching it. When Ryan arrived an hour later, she told him what it had said and what she'd done with it. He looked at the grate. At the small curl of ash that was all that remained of Fitzgerald's last attempt. He's scared, Ryan said. Good, she said. He should be. Something shifted in Ryan's face then. Not a smile exactly, something deeper and quieter than that. The expression of a man who'd spent 2 years in rooms that echoed and had stopped believing he'd find something in the world that didn't. He picked up the stack of documents Webb had marked for the hearing and sat down at the table. She pulled up the second chair. They worked until the fire burned low, then built it back up, then worked some more. Outside, Wyoming turned toward January. The creek ran, the cabin held, and in Crestfall, 20 miles south, Amos Fitzgerald sat in his office and knew, though he would not yet admit it, not even to himself, that he had picked the wrong woman to underestimate. It makes you wonder. When someone has been told their whole life they aren't worth defending and they build a life anyway, piece by piece, nail by nail, in the cold and alone, what does that say about the people who did the telling? That's the question worth sitting with. Because Eliza Harris is about to walk into a courtroom and answer it in front of everyone. January 2nd came in gray and windless, the kind of cold that didn't move, didn't announce itself, just settled over everything like a fact that had always been true and always would be. The kind of morning that reminded you Wyoming didn't care about your problems. Wyoming was just Wyoming, old and patient and completely indifferent to the small human arrangements happening on its surface. Eliza was up before dawn, not because she'd slept badly. She'd slept fine, which surprised her more than the cold did. She'd expected the night before the hearing to be the worst kind of sleepless, the kind where you rehearse every possible outcome until your own mind becomes the thing working against you. But she'd gone out fast and woken clean, and she sat at the table in the dark drinking coffee and looking at the tin box and feeling, of all things, ready. The word for it wasn't courage. Courage implied she was afraid and pushing through it. This was something quieter than courage. More like the feeling you got when you'd done the preparation correctly, and all that remained was to show up and let it work. Ryan arrived at first light. Webb had gone to the county courthouse the night before to review the room, measure the distance between tables, test the acoustics. Webb was that kind of man. He prepared the way other people breathed automatically, completely, as if preparation were the only thing standing between order and catastrophe, which in his experience it usually was. Ryan looked at her face when she opened the door. You slept, he said. I did. Good. He came in, poured himself coffee from the pot. Webb sent word this morning. Harmondale didn't show. She went still. What do you mean he didn't show? Wasn't at his house this morning. Wasn't at the office. His wife says he left before midnight with a traveling bag. Ryan set down the cup. He ran. The shape of that landed slowly. Then all at once. Dale running meant Dale knew what was coming. Dale knew because Fitzgerald knew. Fitzgerald knew because somewhere between Webb's arrival and this morning, something had moved through Crestfall's network of obligation and fear and landed in Fitzgerald's ear. And Fitzgerald had told Dale to disappear before he could be called to account for the ink on a margin and a bank payment and 4 years of corrupt cooperation. "Does Webb know?" she asked. "Webb says it's better than having him there." Ryan picked his cup back up. A man who runs looks exactly like what he is. Eliza thought about that. Turned it over carefully. He was right. A man who vanished the night before a hearing wasn't a man who had nothing to hide. He was a man who'd calculated what testimony would cost him and decided disappearance was the cheaper option. That calculation was its own kind of testimony. Any judge who'd been on the bench long enough would read it the same way. "Then we go," she said. She put on her coat, the good wool one, dark buttons she'd replaced 2 months ago, with better ones ordered through Dorothy because the originals had been cheap and the wind found cheap buttons. Her boots were the same heavy work boots she always wore because they were reliable, and the road to town had iced overnight, and reliability mattered more than appearance on ice. Her hair was pinned up, not loose. She wasn't dressing for the room. She was dressing to be taken seriously in it, which was a different thing entirely. Ryan looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said anything about how she looked because he'd learned, over months of building beside her, that she didn't need that kind of inventory. And she'd learned that his noticing was never about surfaces. It was always about what was underneath. They rode to Crestfall in the grey morning cold, 20 miles, horses steady on the frozen road, the mountains to the west catching the first pale light at their peaks, while the valley below stayed dark. She didn't rehearse. She'd done all the rehearsing she was going to do. Now she just rode and let the cold air move through her and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of preparation. The courthouse was the back room of the county office building, a low log structure on Crestfall's north end, with a wood stove that someone had been feeding since before dawn. The room smelled of pine smoke and old paper, and the particular tension of gathered people who knew the stakes and had already chosen their sides before they walked in. It was more crowded than Eliza expected. Not just the official parties, not just Sutton and his 3 witnesses, and the various Fitzgerald-adjacent officials who'd appeared to see the thing concluded in their employer's favor. Regular people had come. A farmer she recognized from the road north. The woman who ran the feed store, standing near the back wall with her arms crossed. The Hargrove family young husband and wife, their 5-year-old daughter sitting on a bench with her feet swinging, holding the hem of her coat in both hands. Ben Watts in the front row, his big hands folded in his lap, face set like iron. Eyes forward, Dorothy Vance, naturally already seated and already watching everything with the quiet attention of a woman who had decided to remember every detail. The room went quieter when Eliza walked in. Not silent, quieter. The particular adjustment of a crowd recalibrating itself to the presence of the person the whole thing was about. She walked straight to the plaintiff's table where Webb was already seated, his leather case open, documents arranged with the precision of a man who'd done this enough times to know that disorder on a table communicated disorder in a case. She sat beside him, set her hands flat on the table, looked at the judge's chair empty still. Waiting Sutton was at the opposing table. Polished, composed, the composure of a man who'd done this before and expected to do it again. He glanced at Eliza once, just once. The glance of a man assessing an obstacle and determining its likely resistance. Ryan sat in the row directly behind Eliza. She didn't look back, but she knew exactly where he was. 6 months of working beside a person gave you a sense of their location in a room that didn't require looking. A kind of peripheral awareness that had nothing to do with sight. Judge Crawford came in. 60, compact, with the expression of a man who'd heard too many performances and was no longer susceptible to them. He sat, arranged his papers, looked at the room over the top of his glasses with the unhurried attention of someone who was going to take as long as he needed and didn't particularly care what anyone thought about that. "We're here on the matter of Harris versus the territory," he said. "Specifically the arson charge filed by Mr. Sutton on behalf of interested parties." He looked at Sutton. "Proceed." Sutton was good. That was the honest accounting of it. He was precise and unhurried, and he laid out the case the way a careful man laid foundation, each piece placed before the next. Gaps, no flourish. Nothing that could be easily attacked because nothing was overextended. Ed Marsh took the stand and said in a steady voice that he'd seen Eliza outside her house before the fire started. He said it the way a man says something he's rehearsed enough times that it no longer feels like a lie, it feels like memory. That was the dangerous kind of false testimony. The kind that had been repeated until it calcified into something the speaker almost believed. The elder Cooley brother said essentially the same thing, with slightly different details that were probably designed to make the testimonies seem independently arrived at rather than coordinated. Widow Prentice, who did not look at Eliza once during her testimony, not once, kept her eyes on the wall above the judge's head, said she'd been at the door of the Harris house that evening and had seen the woman of the house standing in the yard while the lamp was still lit inside. Each testimony landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Circles spreading outward, reaching the edges. Eliza sat still through all of it. Not stiff still. The stillness of someone who had decided the only useful thing was to be exactly what she was, and let the room see it clearly. No performance of innocence, no visible distress. Just a woman sitting at a table with her hands flat on the wood, present and unhurried, as if she had nowhere else to be and nothing to hide, and all the time in the world for the truth to arrive at its own pace. Webb cross-examined each witness with the same measured quality he brought to everything quietly, without drama, without the theatrical aggression that some lawyers use to perform competence for a watching crowd. He wasn't performing, he was working. He asked Marsh whether he'd spoken with Mr. Fitzgerald in the week before filing his affidavit. Marsh said he didn't recall. Webb nodded at the non-answer with the small, patient nod of a man who'd expected exactly that response and had already accounted for it. He moved on. He asked the Cooley brother what time it had been when he claimed to see Mrs. Harris outside. The brother said around 8 in the evening. Webb produced the fire department log, a simple document, handwritten by the volunteer captain on the night of the fire, which placed the alarm call at 7:42, which meant the fire was already visible from the street at 7:42, which meant the roof was already burning at 7:42, which meant the lamp was not still burning peacefully inside at 8 o'clock, because by 8 o'clock the roof was gone. Cooley's timeline fell apart in approximately 90 seconds. Not dramatically. Not in a single gasping moment with the gallery reacting. It just stopped holding up. Quietly, under Webb's patient arithmetic, the seams of the lie showed themselves one by one, and once the seams showed, the whole construction lost its authority. Widow Prentice was harder. Because Prentice wasn't lying about everything. She had been at the door that evening, she had seen Eliza outside. Those two facts were true. What she hadn't said was what Eliza had been doing outside, or what she'd heard from inside the house in the minutes before the lamp went over. Webb stood for the cross-examination and was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. The kind of quiet that made a room pay attention, Mrs. Prentice. When you arrived at the door of the Harris home that evening before the fire, as you've stated, did you hear anything from inside the house? Prentice's hands folded tighter in her lap. I don't recall. You don't recall. Webb nodded, picked up a piece of paper from his table. Mrs. Prentice, did you speak with anyone about your testimony before today's hearing? Anyone associated with Mr. Fitzgerald's business interests? I may have spoken. Yes or no, Mrs. Prentice? The room held its breath. Yes, she said. Very quietly, the room shifted. Just slightly, enough. The kind of shift you felt rather than saw, a collective adjustment of understanding among the people watching, a recalibration of what they were witnessing. Not a dramatic revelation, something more unsettling than drama. The quiet confirmation of what most people in the room had already suspected but hadn't wanted to say aloud. Then Webb presented the purchase agreement. He laid it before Judge Crawford without ceremony, set it on the bench, stepped back, let the document speak for itself. Crawford picked it up. Read it once. Read the margin notation twice. The way Ryan had read it. Slow, twice. The way you read something when you want to be certain you're reading what you think you're reading. This notation in the margin, Crawford said. His voice hadn't changed, but something underneath it had. Whose handwriting is this? That is precisely what we'd like to establish, Your Honor, Webb said. We have testimony from a witness who was present at the county recorder's office during the sale process in March of 1878. Sutton stood up. Objection to the relevance of sit down, Mr. Sutton. Crawford's voice was the same volume it had been all morning. But something in it had gone flat in a way that wasn't neutral. I'll determine what's relevant. Continue, Mr. Webb. Dorothy Vance took the stand. She walked to it the way she walked everywhere, like she'd been going there her whole life and had arrived right on schedule. She sat down, adjusted her coat, looked at Judge Crawford with the direct gaze of a woman who had no particular fear of institutions or the men who ran them. She told it plainly. The land office next door. Her own registration renewal in March of 1878, which put her there on the same days Webb had already established through county records. Fitzgerald coming out of the recorder's office on the second day. The ink on his right hand, not a small smear from touching a wet page. The kind of ink that got on your hand when you were writing something yourself, pressing down hard, bearing on it with intention. And what was Mr. Fitzgerald's demeanor when you observed him leaving the recorder's office? Webb asked. Dorothy considered this with the care she gave to precise descriptions. Satisfied, she said. The specific way a man looks when something has gone the way he planned it to go. Sutton did not cross-examine Dorothy Vance. He looked at her once, assessed the room's posture toward her, and made the correct calculation that there was nothing to be gained by questioning a woman who'd been quietly managing Crestfall's social landscape for 20 years and knew where everybody was buried. Figuratively speaking, then Ben Watts took the stand. He sat the way he stood, squared up, nothing wasted, the posture of a man who dealt in right angles and straight lines and had no patience for anything that wasn't level. He confirmed the door hinge repair, confirmed the dates 3 consecutive days in March, working on the frame of the recorder's office door, confirmed seeing Fitzgerald inside the recorder's office on the second day, standing at the record counter with Dale, speaking in a lowered voice for an extended period, and then he said the other thing, the thing he hadn't said before. The thing he'd been carrying since October of 1880 like a stone in a coat pocket, heavy enough to notice, small enough to keep ignoring. I was on the Harris Road the night of the fire, he said. His voice didn't waver, didn't perform conviction, just stated it the way he'd state the measurement of a piece of iron he was working. I pulled up when I saw the roof going. I saw Harold Harris in the doorway. He had his wife by the arm. She was trying to get out. He pulled her back in. He stopped. Looked at Crawford directly. I have thought about that every single day for 2 years. I should have stopped sooner. I didn't. I'm saying it now because now is when it counts. The room was so quiet you could hear the wood stove working in the corner. Crawford looked at Watts for a long moment. The look of a judge taking the full measure of a witness, not just what he was saying, but whether he was saying it because it was true or because he'd been arranged to say it. Crawford had been on the bench long enough to know the difference. Then he looked at Sutton. Sutton was very still, the specific stillness of a man standing on the floor of what he'd built, watching it give way under his feet, calculating whether there was anything left to stand on. There wasn't. The foundation was gone. Cooley's timeline was broken. Prentice had admitted coordination with Fitzgerald. Dorothy's testimony placed Fitzgerald at the recorder's office with ink on his hands. Watts had destroyed the core of the arson narrative with 30 seconds of plain speech. And the document, the margin notation, sat on Crawford's bench, like an anchor line dropped into deep water, pulling the whole of Sutton's case down with it. Crawford didn't deliberate long. He looked at the documents laid before him. He looked at Sutton. He looked at Eliza. Case dismissed, he said. And then, without pause, furthermore, I am referring the conduct of County Recorder Harmon Dale to the Territorial Governor's Office for formal review, and I would strongly suggest, Mr. Sutton, that you consult carefully about your continued practice in this territory before you file another proceeding constructed in this manner. Sutton gathered his papers, said nothing, which was the only correct thing left for him to say. Fitzgerald was not in the room. He hadn't come himself, of course he hadn't. Men like Fitzgerald sent lawyers and bought clerks and arranged the machinery from a comfortable distance and never showed up for the parts that might go wrong. He was 20 miles away, or 50, or wherever he'd decided to be while his carefully constructed plan ran its course. Except it hadn't run his course. It had run off the road entirely, and now the governor's office was involved. And Dale was somewhere in Nebraska with a traveling bag, and Sutton was packing up his table with the deliberate movements of a man trying very hard not to look like he was retreating. Eliza sat at the plaintiff's table while the room reorganized itself around her. People standing, talking, the noise of a crowd processing what it had just witnessed. Webb was packing his case with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done exactly what he came to do and was already thinking about the next thing. Ryan came through the thinning crowd and sat in the chair Webb had vacated. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. They sat for a moment in the room where it had just been decided, in the particular quiet of aftermath, and let it be over. "It's done," she said. "It's done." She looked at the table, at her hands on it. At the place where the tin box documents had been spread out, returned to Webb's case now, and on their way back to wherever they belonged. She thought about the floorboard she'd cut. The 3 tries to get it level. The night she'd lain awake calculating whether the papers were safer in the ground or on her person or somewhere else entirely. 2 years of carrying that box. She could stop now. "Thank you," she said. "You did most of it." His voice was honest in the way it always was, no false modesty, no pride dressed up as humility, just accurate. "The box, the papers. Ben Watts was yours. Dorothy was yours. I paid for Webb. Webb won it. Webb had something to win with. You kept it for 2 years under a floorboard you cut yourself." He looked at her. "That's not nothing, that's everything." She looked at him for a moment. Then she stood up. "I need some air," she said. They went outside together into the January cold. The day had brightened while they were inside. Pale winter sun cutting through the cloud cover, sharp-edged shadows on the frozen street. Main Street was quiet the way it gets, after something significant, people dispersing back to their regular business, with the slightly dazed air of spectators after an unexpected outcome, not quite sure yet what to do with what they'd witnessed. Dorothy Vance appeared at Eliza's elbow approximately 4 seconds after they stepped outside, which was, given that Dorothy had been inside the courthouse, a feat of mobility that said something about her priorities. "Well," Dorothy said. "Well," Eliza agreed. "Sutton's already at the hotel settling his bill." Dorothy had clearly done a full visual survey of Main Street before speaking. She always did. "He'll be on the afternoon stage." She paused. "Dale's wife is asking around about her husband. Someone is going to have to tell her he's probably in Nebraska by now." "That's not our problem," Ryan said. "No," Dorothy agreed pleasantly. "It's his." She looked at Eliza. Looked at her for a moment in the particular Dorothy Vance way, attentive without being sentimental, warm without being soft. Then she did the thing she almost never did. She put her arms around Eliza, one solid, certain embrace. Not brief and ceremonial, real. The kind of embrace that said things words would only diminish. "About time," she said, into Eliza's shoulder. Meaning the hearing, possibly. Meaning other things too, almost certainly. Then she released her, straightened her own coat, and walked back down Main Street with the air of a woman who had completed a necessary task and had several other necessary tasks already scheduled for the afternoon. Eliza stood where she was for a moment. Ryan watched Dorothy go. "She terrifies me a little," he said. "She terrifies everyone a little. That's why she's useful." They didn't go back to the cabin immediately. There were things to manage. Webb needed a final consultation about the referral to the governor's office. The county recorder's position needed to be formally noted as vacant pending review. Ryan needed to send a letter to his contact in Cheyenne confirming the outcome. Small procedural tasks. The machinery of aftermath, which was less dramatic than the machinery of conflict but equally necessary. It was mid-afternoon by the time they rode north out of Crestfall. The sun already dropping toward the mountain peaks. The road home gold-lit and quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned. Halfway there, 2 riders came from the south trail moving fast. Eliza saw them first. Felt Ryan register them. A half-second later, his posture shifted. That particular attention that was neither alarm nor ease, but the middle state of a man who'd been paying attention to his surroundings his whole life. Samuel Briggs and one of Ryan's ranch hands. Samuel pulled up alongside them. "Fitzgerald left this morning," Samuel said. No preamble, because Samuel Briggs didn't do preamble. Took 2 wagons. His clerk says he's moving his operation to Cheyenne. "Doesn't plan to come back," Ryan looked at him. "Permanent, looks like?" Samuel's expression was the same as always, dry, unimpressed, cataloging another entry in a long list of human behavior he'd observed and found wanting. "Word is the governor's office sent someone down last week. Before the hearing. Seems the Dale situation was bigger than just this one county. Couple of other clerks, couple of other land deals." He glanced at Eliza. "Whatever you had in that tin box, it wasn't just about you." She thought about that. About Thomas refusing Fitzgerald 3 times. About Thomas keeping the notation on the purchase agreement because he knew it was wrong, and he kept things that were evidence of wrong, even when he was the only one who knew they were evidence. Even when the knowing had cost him something, Thomas hadn't been wrong about everything. Good, she said. Samuel looked at her for a moment. Just a moment, the assessing look of a man who had known Ryan Cole for 30 years and had been watching the situation on that north claim with quiet interest for the past several months. Good, Samuel agreed, and rode on without another word, because Samuel Briggs understood that some moments didn't need commentary, and this was one of them. Fitzgerald came to see her once before he left. She'd heard from Dorothy that he was gone. Samuel's information was usually right, and Dorothy's was always right. So when she heard a horse on the South Trail the following morning and looked out the window and saw Amos Fitzgerald alone, no clerk, no entourage, no borrowed authority, standing in front of her cabin with his hat literally in his hands, she stood at the window for a moment before she moved. He looked smaller without his context. Without the church elders flanking him and the town watching, and the weight of Crestfall's collective fear of his disapproval behind him. Just a man in an expensive coat that was slightly wrong for the weather, standing in front of a cabin he'd tried to take from the woman who built it and failed. She opened the door. Didn't invite him in, Miss Harris. He looked at her, not the calculating look from before, not the oily smile. Something more uncomfortable than either of those. The look of a man standing in a place he hadn't expected to reach, which was accountability, which was a place most men like him never stood. I came to say I misjudged the situation. She let that sit there for a moment, let him feel its weight. You didn't misjudge, she said. Her voice was even. Not cold, just accurate. The voice she used for facts. You knew exactly what you were doing. You calculated that I had no money, no connections, no standing in this town. You calculated that a woman with a scar and a bad reputation and no husband couldn't defend a property claim against a man like you. She looked at him directly. You were wrong about the calculation, not about the intent. He looked at his hat. At the brim he was turning in his hands. I hope there isn't, she said. No hard feelings, no soft ones either. She tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was finishing an assessment. But there's no business between us. There never will be. Good day, Mr. Fitzgerald. He left. Rode south down the trail that curved and disappeared into the pines. She stood in the doorway and watched him go until the trees closed behind him. From behind her, from the workbench where Ryan had been checking the chimney connection. He took his hat off. She turned. He was looking out the side window, watching the empty South Trail. That's the best thing I can say about Amos Fitzgerald, she said. He took his hat off. High praise. It is for him. Ryan set down the tool he'd been holding, turned from the window, looked at her with the expression she'd started to recognize as the one he wore when he was about to say something true and wasn't going to dress it up or soften its is. You know you won that, he said. We won it. No, he crossed the room toward her. You kept the papers. You found Ben Watts. You refused to sell and refused to leave and refused to make it easy for him for 4 years running. He stopped in front of her. I helped. You won it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took the tool out of his hand, set it on the table, and kissed him. Not tentative, she'd been thinking about it long enough that tentative wasn't where she was starting. Real, certain. Her hand on his jaw, his hands finding her waist with the careful attention he gave to things that mattered to him, which was the same attention he gave to good work, which was the highest compliment she knew how to receive. When she pulled back, he looked at her with the expression of a man who'd just had something very good happen and wasn't certain it was real yet. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. She picked his tool up from the table and handed it back to him. The flue pipe, she said. He went back to the chimney. She went back to the fence rail she'd been sanding. Outside, the winter sun was doing what Wyoming winter sun did, offering light without warmth, filling the sky with something bright and cold and honest. The creek ran on the eastern boundary. The cabin stood solid behind them, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else about it, because everything that needed saying had been said, and the rest of it was just going to be lived. February came and went in a series of long, quiet days that settled into each other like snow settling into itself, each one distinct in the moment, each one part of a larger, undisturbed whole. The work changed. Not stopped, there was always work on this kind of land. There would always be work. The land itself saw to that. But the urgency of building for survival shifted into something different. Building for permanence. For years from now rather than just this winter. For the kind of future that assumed itself without asking permission, Ryan came most days. Sometimes 2 days running when the ranch allowed. He stopped making the ride back in the dark by mutual unspoken agreement, the way they'd arrived at most of their arrangements through the natural accumulation of practical decisions that turned out to mean something more than practicality. He slept in the chair first, then he built a second chair, then he built a cot in the corner of the main room, because a cot was more practical than a chair for a man his size. Then he brought a second wool blanket because one wasn't sufficient for a Wyoming February. Nobody commented on these developments, except Dorothy, who commented on all of them with great enthusiasm and very little shame about it. A cot, she said one Thursday, looking at it with the expression of a woman encountering an artifact of historical significance. A cot. In the corner, for when it's too cold to ride back, Eliza said. Dorothy reached over and touched the edge of the wool blanket, which was the good one from Ryan's ranch house. Nice blanket. It's practical. Extremely, Dorothy agreed, in a tone that suggested she didn't believe a word of it. Ryan, who had been devoting his entire attention to the window latch he was adjusting, cleared his throat. Dorothy left the blanket alone and sat down with her coffee and didn't mention the cot again. For approximately 4 days, at which point she mentioned it to Samuel Briggs, who mentioned it in passing to 2 of Ryan's ranch hands, who said absolutely nothing to Ryan directly but whose expressions the next time they saw him contained an entire conversation's worth of information. Ryan said nothing to any of them. But he built the cot a few inches longer because the first version had been slightly short and he'd been getting a crick in his neck. And he was a man who fixed things when he noticed they needed fixing, regardless of what anybody thought about the fixing. March came in cold and stayed that way for the first 2 weeks, which was normal for Wyoming, and which neither of them mentioned because there was no point mentioning the obvious. The ground was still frozen, but the light had changed. Longer days, the sun sitting at a higher angle, the particular quality of March light that promised nothing outright but gave you enough warmth at noon to believe April was real and coming. Eliza spent the first days of March turning the garden plot. Hard work, frozen earth, the pickaxe first to break through the frost crust and then the mattock to loosen what was underneath. Ryan arrived the second morning and picked up the second mattock without being asked, and they worked side by side through the morning, the sound of metal on hard ground steady and purposeful and slightly musical in the way that repetitive work sometimes became when 2 people found the same rhythm. She'd planned the garden out on paper over the winter rows of carrots, beans, potatoes, the practical things first because that was always the order of operations, and then along the eastern edge where the morning sun hit longest and the soil was warmest, soonest, wildflowers, because she wanted color, because the mountains gave you grays and whites and browns and the occasional dramatic sky, but color at ground level was something you had to decide to make. She wanted to make it. Ryan read the garden plan when she left it on the table one evening. He didn't say anything about it. 3 days later she went out to check the eastern edge and found he'd already turned that section. Separately from the vegetable rows, turned and raked it smooth, the way you prepared ground for seeds that needed a fine tilth and couldn't push through clods. She stood there looking at it for a moment. The smooth, dark earth of the eastern edge, ready for whatever she wanted to put in it. He came out of the barn with the tools he'd been cleaning and stopped when he saw her standing there. It needed doing, he said. Yes, she said. It did. She went inside and got the packet of wildflower seeds she'd ordered through Dorothy in February, a mix, multiple varieties, chosen for the altitude and the season length. Came back out. He walked over, and they planted the eastern edge together in the cold March morning, working down the row in companionable silence, the seeds going into the frozen-edged ground in the faith that the ground would do what ground always did, wait and warm, and eventually become what you'd put into it. That afternoon, sitting on the porch bench he'd built in February, solid, wide enough for 2, anchored to the cabin wall with the intention of lasting more than 1 season, Ryan produced a letter from his coat pocket. From Webb, he said. The governor's office confirmed the investigation into Dale. 3 other counties involved. Sutton's license is under review again. He folded the letter. It's over. Completely over. She took the letter. Read it herself. Set it on her knee. Ben Watts should know, she said. I'll tell him Saturday when I ride through. Dorothy already knows. Dorothy always already knows. That's not a criticism? No, he agreed. It's just a fact. She looked at the garden plot, at the smooth eastern edge where the seeds were in the ground, at the vegetable rows they'd turned together, at the mountains beyond, which were beginning to show the first faint differentiation between snow and bare rock as the season changed its mind slowly, the way seasons did. I've been thinking, she said. He waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the first things she'd noticed about him, and one of the things she'd come to rely on most. The road between here and your ranch, she said. It's manageable in good weather, it's less manageable in bad. Over years that becomes, she stopped. Reorganized, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just noting that the arithmetic of it changes over time. He was quiet for a moment. What would the arithmetic look like if it worked? 2 properties, connected. The boundary following the creek, the way it already does. Both names on the deeds they belong to, she looked at him. Harris claim stays Harris claim. That was never a question, he said. I know. She looked back at the garden. I just needed to say it out loud. What else do you need to say out loud? She thought about it. About the last 6 months. About the log she'd been dragging up a hill alone when he appeared on the ridge. About the arrangement that became something else before either of them had the words for it. About the hearing and the tin box and the papers she'd kept for 2 years, not because she was afraid, but because she'd learned that truth needed tending the same way a garden did. It needed to be kept and protected and ready for the moment it was needed. Ask me to marry you, she said, when the wildflowers bloom. I want to say yes when the world's alive again. He looked at her, the steady brown of his eyes in the March light. That's not a no, he said. That's very much not a no deal, he said. She took his hand, not tentatively, just took it, the way you take something you've already decided belongs there. They sat while the afternoon light went long across the garden plot, and the mountains turned their slow afternoon colors, and the creek on the eastern boundary ran its constant patient sound that had been there before all of this, and would be there after. April bloomed early that year. The first week brought real rain instead of snow, the soft, persistent kind that went into the ground rather than lying on top of it. The kind that meant spring was serious about arriving this time, and not just making a preliminary appearance. The creek rose slightly. The garden started showing the first thread-thin green of seedlings breaking through the dark soil, tentative and certain at once the way new things were, and on the eastern edge, in the section Ryan had raked smooth and they'd seeded together on that cold March morning, the wildflowers came, not all at once. First one patch of yellow low to the ground, then a few days later the purple ones spreading sideways from where they'd gone in, then the white ones in the gaps between, small and multiple, and filling the space with the quiet determination of things that had been waiting in the dark for exactly this amount of warmth and light. By the 3rd week of April, the entire eastern edge was alive with color that moved in the spring wind like something breathing. She went out in the morning to look at it and stood there for a long time. Long enough that the sun moved and her coffee went cold in her hand and she didn't notice. She heard his horse before she saw it. The familiar cadence of it on the track, unhurried, right when he said he'd be there, because he was always right when he said he'd be there. He came around the cabin, dismounted, tied the horse, walked toward the garden, saw the flowers, looked at her. She turned from the flowers and looked back at him. Ask me, she said. He walked the last few feet, stopped in front of her, looked at her the way he looked at the mountain vista on clear mornings, not with admiration exactly, which had too much performance in it, but with recognition. With the particular piece of a man who'd found the thing that made sense of all the other things and was simply glad to be standing in front of it. Marry me, Eliza Harris. Yes. Simple as that. Simple as work. Simple as 2 people who'd built something real together, saying the true thing out loud in a garden in Wyoming in April, with the mountains watching and the creek running and the wildflowers moving in the spring wind, and nobody around to perform for except each other, which was the only audience either of them had ever wanted. He put his arms around her. She let him. The coffee cup was still in her hand, and she set it down on the fence post because that was practical. And then she wasn't thinking about practical things for a while. Dorothy Vance arrived at 3 in the afternoon. She had not been sent for. She had not been told. She arrived because Dorothy Vance had a particular instinct for the days that mattered, and had never once in her life missed one. She came around the corner of the cabin and saw them sitting on the porch bench, close together, the particular kind of close that answered every question without a word being spoken. She stopped walking, looked at Eliza. Eliza smiled, not the small, careful one, not the one she gave to people she wasn't sure of yet, the real one, full, unguarded. Dorothy made a sound that she would never afterward admit contained any emotion whatsoever. Then she crossed the distance in 4 quick steps and had her arms around Eliza before either of them had said a word. Real. Fierce. The embrace of a woman who didn't show this kind of thing often and meant it completely when she did. "About time," she said, into Eliza's shoulder. "About damn time. We're working on your timeline," Eliza said. "My timeline had you both done with this nonsense in November." Dorothy pulled back, straightened up, reassembled herself with the efficiency of a woman who had no intention of being caught being sentimental twice in the same afternoon. Looked at Ryan. "You. Finally, I worked up to it," he said. "You took 4 months. There was a legal case in between." Dorothy turned this over. "The legal case," she repeated, to nobody in particular. "He counts the legal case." She walked past them both into the cabin, located the coffee pot, helped herself as she always did without asking, because asking was for people who weren't certain of their welcome. Came back to the doorway, looked at the wildflowers on the eastern edge of the garden, the color of them against the dark soil, the way they moved. Something different moved through her face. Not the dry commentary, not the brisk efficiency. Something quieter and more genuine, the expression of a woman who had seen a lot of difficult things in her life and recognized, when she encountered it, the particular rarity of a good outcome. "They're beautiful," she said. Not casually. "Yes," Eliza said. "They are." The wedding was the 15th of May. Reverend Calloway came up from Laramie young, broad-shouldered, with the practical faith of a man who'd conducted services in hailstorms and at bedsides and understood that what mattered was the sincerity of the thing, not the ceremony around it. Eliza had written to him in February after asking around, after finding that Calloway was the kind of minister who asked questions before pronouncing and actually listened to the answers. He'd asked 2 questions when she wrote to him about the ceremony. Both of them were the right questions. She'd known immediately the wedding was at the cabin, at the garden edge, with the wildflowers behind them, and the mountains ahead and the creek making its constant understated sound on the eastern boundary. The guest list was small, not because of shame or diminishment, but because this was not a performance. This was a private thing made briefly visible to the people who had actually shown up when it mattered. Samuel Briggs stood in the back row with the specific expression of a man making a concentrated effort not to show that he was moved by what he was witnessing. He was not succeeding, and he knew he was not succeeding, and he had committed to the effort anyway, because some things were worth the attempt, even when the outcome was uncertain. Ben Watts came. He stood straight in a pressed shirt that was slightly too long in the sleeves, and said nothing before the ceremony and nothing after it and didn't need to. His being there said what words would only have made smaller. The Hargrove family sat on the left side, the young couple with their 5-year-old, who was wearing a yellow dress slightly too big for her, and who had quietly picked a handful of wildflowers from the eastern edge of the garden, without quite asking permission. Eliza had watched her do it through the window and let her, because the girl had the right instinct even if the execution needed some refinement, which was true of most worthwhile things at the beginning. Dorothy Vance wore a hat she had clearly been saving for an occasion she'd judged sufficient. This was the occasion. Ryan wore clean clothes, good dark flannel, not the work-worn kind, dark trousers. His Stetson held in his hands throughout the ceremony because the sky was clear and there was no practical reason to wear it, and because today, of all days, the hat belonged in his hands rather than on his head. Eliza wore the blue wool dress she'd made herself over the winter. Not white, she hadn't wanted white. She'd wanted the color of winter sky at the moment it decided to clear, and she'd made what she wanted, the way she'd always made what she wanted out of the materials available. Her hair was down, the scar was in the May afternoon light, pale and present, part of her face the way everything was part of her face after enough time, making no apologies, asking for none, simply there. She walked from the cabin door to where Ryan stood at the garden edge alone. No one gave her away. She gave herself, the way she'd always given herself deliberately, on her own terms, to the thing she'd decided was worth it. Calloway read what she'd asked him to read, not a long service, because she hadn't wanted a long service. A few words about the particular courage of choosing honesty over ease, about 2 people who had built something real out of hard materials and cold seasons and trusted it to hold. About what it meant to begin again when beginning again seemed impossible, and to find in the beginning something better than what came before. The words were said. Ryan looked at her the way he'd looked at the mountain vista on clear mornings, not performance, not admiration, recognition. The particular piece of a man who had found the thing that made sense of everything else, and was simply glad to be standing in front of it in May sunlight with the wild flowers in the wind behind him. She kissed him, properly, in front of everyone, without caring who was watching, because she was done with the performance of caution, done with arranging herself for other people's comfort, done with making herself smaller to fit the space they'd assigned her. Samuel Briggs made a sound in the back, a small sound, cleared his throat with the vigor of a man attacking something that had no business being there. Dorothy Vance said without quite keeping it under her breath. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Samuel, just cry," which made the 5-year-old laugh. Bright and sudden, the laugh of a child who finds adult behavior genuinely funny and has no reason to pretend otherwise, which made everyone else laugh, which was how the ceremony ended, not with solemnity but with laughter in a garden in May in Wyoming, the wildflowers in full color, the mountains unchanged and patient, there before all of this and there long after. Fall came the way it did in Wyoming, hard and fast, and without apology, the way anything honest arrived. The road between the two properties had been cleared and widened in the summer by Ryan and 2 of his ranch hands, and Ben Watts, who showed up on a Saturday with a mattock and no explanation and was welcomed accordingly. Not merged, still 2 separate properties, Harris Claim and Cole Ranch. The boundary following the creek that Fitzgerald had wanted. The creek that ran indifferent to everything that had been arranged and rearranged around it, which was the correct attitude for a creek to have. Eliza kept the name Harris Claim. Ryan had never suggested otherwise. She was in the garden in late September, harvesting the last of the bean crop, when the nausea came. She'd been ignoring it for 3 weeks, the way you ignore something when you're not ready yet to know what it means. She'd gone to Dorothy on a Thursday morning for a conversation she'd been preparing herself for, and sat across the boarding house table and said what she'd observed. And Dorothy had listened and nodded once slow. "Yes," Dorothy said. "That's what that is. You're sure?" "I'm sure." Eliza sat with it. Turned it over the way she turned tools in her hands, checking the weight, checking the balance, learning the shape of it before she decided what to do with it. "All right," she said. Dorothy refilled her own coffee cup. Eliza's she left alone, because Dorothy had already been thinking about what was appropriate in the circumstances. "You'll want to tell him soon," she said. "Tonight? Good." That evening, Ryan came in from the south fence line, which he'd ridden out to repair that morning, after discovering a section had been pushed over by a bull who had opinions about boundaries. He was dirty and cold and hungry in the practical way of men who'd been outside doing physical work for 8 hours and had stopped noticing the discomfort 3 hours ago. He came in, washed his hands at the basin, sat at the table. She put a plate in front of him, sat down across from him. He looked at her the way he always looked at her when he sat down, just a look, checking in, the particular look that had nothing to say except there you are and everything to mean by it. "I'm pregnant," she said. He was still for a moment, the specific stillness of a man receiving large information and letting it arrive properly before he responded to it, not reaction, but reception. Then something in his face opened, not into pieces, into room. The way a door opens onto a space you didn't know was there and finds it larger than you expected and better lit. He reached across the table and took her hands, both of them. The calloused, capable, honest hands he'd been watching do good work since the first October afternoon on that ridge, when he'd looked down and seen someone dragging a pine log up a slope alone and thought, "That is a person who doesn't quit." "All right," he said. His voice was different, not louder, deeper, grounded in something new that hadn't been there before and was there now and wasn't going anywhere. "All right," she agreed. Outside, the last of the season's wind moved through the pines. The sound that meant the cold was serious now, that the world was cycling into its next chapter the way it always did, indifferent to human plans and absolutely indifferent to human fear. The kind of wind that had been blowing across these mountains since before any of this and would be blowing long after. The cabin was warm. The fire was strong. The walls held the warmth without effort because they'd been built right, every beam checked, every joint fitted, every nail driven with the understanding that good work was its own argument for the future deep winter. January again, 1 full year from the hearing. The snow was heavy on the ground and the mountains were white to their shoulders, and the valley lay quiet under it all, patient, waiting for the cycle to turn again the way it always turned evenings. Firelight, Ryan read aloud from the Odyssey. Better now, much better, the stumbles rare, the rhythm of the sentences beginning to live in him the way music lived in people who played it long enough. He still occasionally worked through a difficult name with visible effort, and Eliza still occasionally let him work through it, rather than correcting immediately, because he'd told her once that arriving at the right answer himself felt different from being given it, and she understood that, and she respected it. She sat across from him, her hands busy with the mending she'd been putting off, listening the way he'd listened to her, read it the first time completely, nothing withheld, no part of her attention somewhere else. He read the passage about Odysseus finally coming home, about Penelope recognizing him not by his face or his voice or the years that had changed both, but by a secret they'd shared that nobody else in the world knew, about what it meant to be known by someone who had been paying attention long enough that their knowledge of you was made of real things, specific things, things that mattered, things that couldn't be faked or performed or purchased. He got through it without stopping, set the book down on his knee, looked at her across the fire. She was looking at the flames. Her profile in the firelight, the scarred side toward him, the way it always was now, no arrangement, no positioning, just her face the way it was in the world, because she'd stopped needing to manage what he saw a long time ago, and that was its own kind of freedom. Good, she said, quietly. Read it again. He found the page. Started again from the beginning of the passage. His voice in the warm room, the fire ticking, the wind outside doing what Wyoming wind did in January, which was everything it wanted. Outside, the snow fell on Harris Claim and Cole Ranch and the creek that ran between them, and the world was very old and very patient, and very beautiful in the way that honest things were beautiful, not because they were easy or comfortable or convenient, but because they were true. And truth, when you encountered it and chose it and built your life around it, turned out to be the most durable material there was. Pretty faded, everyone knew that. Fancy broke under the first serious pressure it encountered. But honest held through winter after winter, through the weight of everything a life turned out to actually contain, through the grief and the fear and the long patient work of becoming the version of yourself that could be trusted with another person's trust. In the holding, broken things didn't just mend. They became the strongest part of the whole structure. The part that had been tested and held. The part that knew what it was made of, because it had been asked the question and answered it correctly. The mountains knew this. They'd been watching long enough to know most things. The creek knew it too, in the way water knew the shape of the ground it ran across, not by thinking about it, but by running over it, again and again, until the knowing was worn in. And the two people in the cabin on the slope, the scarred woman, and the gray-templed man, and the child growing toward spring in the warmth they'd made together. They were learning it the way all real things were learned. Not in a single moment of revelation, in all the ordinary moments after, every quiet one, every cold morning and warm evening and day of work that was its own reward, because it built something that would still be standing when they were gone. Every honest one. The fire burned. The book lay open on his knee. Her hands moved in the firelight. The walls of the cabin stood solid around them, every beam they'd lifted together, every nail they'd driven, every joint they'd checked and rechecked, because good work deserved the time it took. Every piece of it still holding, still true, still home. Have you ever had to choose between the easy thing and the true thing and found out what you were made of by what you chose? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one.